The ocean was silent, black, and endless, 200 feet below the surface of the Sea of Okhotsk. U.S. Navy divers worked in near total darkness, their breathing heavy through masks, their hands searching by touch along the cold steel of a Soviet undersea cable. Every sound mattered, the hiss of oxygen, the faint hum of equipment, because above them, Soviet warships patrolled. If discovered, the penalty was not detention, it would be death. The mission was codenamed Ivy Bells, its objective to tap a live communications cable that carried the Soviet Union's most secret naval transmissions, orders, patrol schedules, and nuclear deployment commands. If successful, it would give the United States access to the heartbeat of the Soviet Pacific Fleet. If it failed, divers and submariners would be abandoned in hostile waters, beyond rescue, beyond diplomacy. The divers worked with patience and terror, bolting a recording device to the line. The cable hummed faintly, carrying the voices of Soviet admirals. For the first time, America would be listening in, pulling secrets from the ocean floor. These records are drawn from declassified files and public archives. Tell us in the comments, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? Like and subscribe for more declassified stories. The Cold War of the 1970s was not only fought in Berlin alleyways or Cuban missile fields, it was fought in silence, across oceans that stretched wider than empires, where submarines stalked each other in games of stealth that could end in nuclear fire. For the United States and the Soviet Union, the question of who controlled the seas was inseparable from who controlled the future. At the heart of this rivalry was the Sea of Okhotsk, a body of water east of Siberia, ringed by Soviet territory and closed off like a private lake. Moscow treated it as a sanctuary, a bastion where its Pacific Fleet's ballistic missile submarines could patrol undisturbed. From this protected zone, the Soviets could launch nuclear missiles that would reach American cities within minutes. The United States needed to know what those submarines were doing when they were leaving port, where they were hiding. But the Okhotsk was a fortress. The Soviets enforced a closed sea doctrine, declaring it their internal waters. They ringed it with radar stations, sonar nets, patrol boats, and aircraft. Foreign ships risked being fired upon if caught inside. For decades, the Okhotsk remained a blank spot on American naval maps, an area the Soviets assumed was impenetrable. Inside Langley, Virginia, and at the Pentagon, that blank spot was intolerable. The CIA and the U.S. Navy's submarine force began searching for ways to pierce the veil. Overhead satellites could only show so much. Intercepted radio chatter gave glimpses but not clarity. The Soviets had learned to keep their most sensitive communications off the airwaves. Instead, they ran secure undersea cables along the seabed, carrying voice traffic between bases and command posts. These cables were their arteries of command, silent, hidden, believed to be untouchable. That belief was exactly what made them valuable. If the US could somehow tap a Soviet military cable without being detected, the prize would be extraordinary. Direct transcripts of conversations between admirals, raw data on submarine deployments, insights into Soviet nuclear strategy. It would be the equivalent of reading the enemy's diary each night. The mandate was given: find a way to the bottom of the Sea of Okhotsk and attach a listening device to the Soviet cable. It was audacious, dangerous, and technically daunting. The mission required a submarine that could penetrate Soviet waters undetected, divers who could operate in freezing darkness, and equipment that could record thousands of hours of conversations without alerting the Soviets. By 1971, The CIA and Navy had chosen their platform, the USS Halibut, a specially modified submarine designed for covert operations. Halibut was no ordinary vessel. Once armed with missiles, she had been converted into a spy sub, equipped with side-scan sonar, diver lockout chambers, and thruster systems that allowed her to hover silently above the ocean floor. Her crew was a mix of submariners and elite divers trained to work at crushing depths. The plan was simple in outline, impossible in execution. Sail Halibut into the Sea of Okhotsk, locate the cable by sonar, send divers out to find it, and attach a recording pod disguised to look like a piece of debris. Then return months later, retrieve the recordings, and replace the device with fresh tapes. Each cycle would deliver priceless intelligence straight from the Soviet command chain. The risks were unthinkable. If Halibut was detected inside the Okhotsk, the Soviets would consider it an armed intrusion. They could drop depth charges, hunt her down with submarines, or even open fire without warning. The crew would have no chance of rescue. The nearest U.S. waters were thousands of miles away. Even if Halibut escaped detection, the divers faced their own death trap. At depths of 400 feet, in frigid currents, even the best equipment could fail. A mask leak, a regulator freeze, a line snagged on the cable. Each could be fatal. Yet in the balance of the Cold War, the gamble was deemed worth it. The CIA's hunger for secrets and the Navy's confidence in its submariners created a partnership that would soon make history. The mandate was signed. The United States would attempt the first undersea cable tap of the Cold War. It would be known by the codename Ivy Bells. The Sea of Okhotsk was unlike any other battlefield. It was not patrolled by tanks or soldiers, but by pressure, cold, and silence. To reach its secrets, the US needed tools built for an alien world. The mission's success would hinge on two things: a submarine capable of slipping into forbidden waters, and equipment that could eavesdrop on Soviet admirals without ever giving itself away. The platform chosen was the USS Halibut, a submarine already seasoned in secrecy. Once built as a missile sub, she had been refitted as a spy craft under the Navy's Special Projects portfolio. Halibut carried equipment no other submarine in the world possessed: a massive side-scan sonar rig, nicknamed the Batfish, that could sweep the seabed for objects as small as a Coke can, manipulator arms to retrieve debris, and most crucially, a diver lockout chamber that allowed men to leave and return to the sub while submerged. The Halibut's crew was carefully chosen. Not every submariner could handle the tension of sneaking into Soviet waters, knowing that discovery meant annihilation. Even fewer could work in cooperation with the CIA's shadow world. The divers were drawn from elite Navy saturation teams, trained to operate at depths of 400 feet, where darkness was absolute and cold penetrated every seam of a wetsuit. They practiced in tanks, in lakes, and in the Pacific, rehearsing how to search by touch, how to keep calm when the blackness swallowed everything. The target, the Soviet cable, was itself invisible, buried in silt across much of the seabed. Finding it required precision navigation. Intelligence analysts at the CIA pieced together Soviet maps, fishing reports, and intercepted chatter to narrow down the likely routes. Engineers calculated the cable's signal strength and how it might hum faintly through the water. Halibut's sonar would do the rest, crawling the seabed with patience, searching for a line no wider than a man's arm. Once located, the cable could not simply be cut or spliced. The Soviets would notice instantly if their communications failed. The challenge was to create a device that could sit quietly on the line, record every conversation, and leave no trace of intrusion. Engineers at the National Security Agency and the Navy's labs produced a wiretap pod, unlike anything built before. It was a watertight cylinder about the size of a coffin, equipped with induction coils that could capture the electromagnetic signals flowing through the cable without physically penetrating it. The design was brilliant. The Soviets' messages would be recorded passively, while the cable itself remained untouched and fully functional. The pod was also engineered for stealth. Its outer shell was covered in a rough, barnacle-like coating to make it resemble debris on the seabed. It emitted no signals of its own. It carried enough magnetic tape to record thousands of hours of audio, and it was built with handles and guide rails so that divers, feeling their way along in darkness, could secure it onto the line with bolts. Once in place, the pod would become part of the ocean floor, invisible to Soviet patrols above. Training for the divers was relentless. They practiced the sequence of leaving halibut, swimming through black water with lifelines tethered, searching for the cable, and bolting the pod onto it. Each step had to be perfect. A dropped tool could clatter against the cable and alert sensors. A diver drifting too far could be lost in the currents. Even communication with the submarine was limited to hand tugs on a line, primitive but reliable in the crushing deep. On land, the cover story for Halibut's presence was rehearsed as well. Officially, she was just another American sub on patrol. In reality, her logbooks would conceal missions so sensitive that few even at the Pentagon knew their details. The CIA and Navy agreed that the mission would be compartmentalized. Only a handful of people at Langley and Pacific Fleet Command knew Ivy Bells was underway. Even among Halibut's crew, details were tightly held. The divers knew they were going after a cable. Many of the other sailors simply knew they were going deep into danger for reasons not fully explained. Tradecraft also extended to retrieval. The pod could not transmit its recordings. That would risk exposure. Instead, halibut would return to the site every few months. Divers would remove the pod, bring it aboard, swap out tapes, and return it to the cable. The Soviets would never know their most private conversations were being copied and carried back to Washington. As the mission date neared, tension mounted. Maps were studied, sonar calibrations refined, equipment tested again and again. Ivy Bells would be the first of its kind. A wiretap not in a phone booth or embassy, but in the crushing black waters of the Soviet Union's own backyard. The divers, engineers and case officers all understood what failure meant. It was espionage at the bottom of the world, and the ocean itself would decide if men lived or died. The USS Halibut slipped beneath the waves of the Sea of Okhotsk under strict radio silence. Every man aboard knew where they were headed, into the Soviets' private lake, an area so heavily guarded that even Soviet fishing vessels were known to carry militia radios and report unusual activity. If halibut was spotted, if a single sonar ping gave her away, the Soviet Navy would have unleashed patrols, depth charges, and submarines. The crew would vanish into the cold sea, denied even the dignity of acknowledgement. Finding the cable was like searching for a hair in an ocean. The sonar operators stared at glowing screens in the control room, sweeping the seabed for patterns. Day after day, Halibut moved slowly along the continental shelf, her thrusters allowing her to hover nearly motionless, while the side-scan sonar painted the bottom in ghostly images. Then, finally, they saw it, a faint, narrow line stretching across the seabed, too regular to be anything but man-made. The Soviet cable. Now came the moment of truth. Divers suited up in lockout chambers, their breathing measured, their movements ritual. Each man carried tools, bolts, clamps, lights dimmed to faint glows. As they exited Halibut, the world turned black and silent. Visibility was near zero. Currents tugged at their lines. They worked by touch, gloved hands tracing along the cable until they reached the site selected for the tap. The pod was lowered, its barnacle-coated shell blending with the seabed. Divers secured it with clamps, attaching induction coils that would siphon off every signal running through the line. It was not quick work. Hours passed, in the freezing dark, lungs burning with each breath. The only sounds were exhaled bubbles and the faint scrape of metal against metal. When it was done, the pod lay invisible on the ocean floor, listening silently to the heartbeat of the Soviet Navy. Back on Halibut, the tension was suffocating. No one spoke louder than a whisper. The captain knew Soviet sonar nets could pick up stray noise. Slowly, carefully, Halibut pulled away, retreating into deeper water. The crew did not celebrate. They waited until they were clear, until the Okhotsk was behind them, before allowing themselves even cautious relief. Weeks later, Halibut returned to retrieve the pod. Divers carried it aboard, careful not to damage the delicate reels of tape inside. When the first recordings were analyzed, the results stunned Langley. Clear voices of Soviet admirals discussing submarine patrols, maintenance schedules, even nuclear readiness. The tap was a goldmine. The U.S. now had direct access to communications the Soviets believed were secure beyond imagination. The success led to expansion. Additional taps were installed. Regular missions were scheduled with Halibut and later submarines like U.S. Pache rotating in to service the pods. Each return brought back reels of Soviet naval secrets, feeding American war planners with intelligence of unmatched quality. The information allowed the U.S. to track Soviet submarines more accurately, to predict deployments, and to gain leverage in nuclear strategy. But success bred risk. The more often Halibut or Pache entered the Okhotsk, the greater the chance of detection. Soviet patrols began to tighten. Submarine commanders reported unfamiliar propeller noises. Fishermen claimed to see periscopes in forbidden waters. Moscow became uneasy. Security was increased around naval bases, yet still the Americans came and went, ghosts in the deep. Then, in the late 1970s, the Soviets began to suspect something more concrete. Some officers noted unusual interference on their cables. Others whispered of American attempts to penetrate their secure zones. What the U.S. did not know was that betrayal from within would soon expose Ivy Bells and put the entire operation in jeopardy. The tapes recovered from the bottom of the Sea of Okhotsk quickly became some of the most valuable intelligence in Washington. Inside soundproof rooms at the National Security Agency, NSA, linguists and analysts bent over reels of magnetic tape, translating the crisp voices of Soviet admirals. There were no ciphers to break, no static to untangle. The Soviets had assumed their undersea cables were invulnerable and left the traffic unencrypted. For the first time in the Cold War, the U.S. was listening directly to the heart of Soviet command. The information that poured out changed the balance of naval warfare. American planners now knew which Soviet submarines were at sea, which were in port, and how maintenance problems delayed deployments. They learned the exact patrol patterns of Soviet ballistic missile subs, how long they lingered in bastion waters when crews rotated, and even what morale looked like inside the fleet. One memo from the NSA to the Pentagon noted simply, "This is gold." But the mission was expensive, not only in dollars, but in risk. Each tap required a full submarine deployment, costing millions in fuel, maintenance, and secrecy budgets, crews risked their lives every time they slipped into the Okhotsk. If a submarine was caught, the diplomatic fallout could ignite a major Cold War crisis. Some within the Pentagon argued it was too dangerous, that satellites and acoustic arrays, like SOSUS, could deliver enough intelligence. Yet the CIA and Navy insisted the tapes were irreplaceable. They provided clarity that no satellite could, grounding U.S. strategy in hard fact rather than inference. Politically, the operation was delicate. Only a handful of senior officials were briefed. The President, the National Security Advisor, the Director of Central Intelligence, and the Navy's top admirals. Ivy Bells was never discussed in open hearings. Funds were buried inside black budgets, explained only as special projects. When updates were given, they were couched in euphemism. Coverage of adversary naval readiness has improved. The Soviets, for their part, clung to their belief in the sanctity of the OK. They treated it as an internal sea, patrolled it heavily, and guarded its cables with secrecy. The assumption was simple. No foreign submarine could reach so far, operate so deep, and leave undetected. To Moscow, the Okhotsk was a bastion, an impregnable moat for their nuclear deterrent. They poured money into sonar nets, hydrophone arrays, and coastal defenses. Fishermen and coastal villagers were recruited as watchers, reporting any sight of unusual wakes or periscopes. And yet, despite the expense and vigilance, the Americans returned again and again. The intelligence Ivy Bells provided gave Washington leverage at the negotiating table as well. During arms control discussions, U.S. diplomats carried quiet confidence, backed by secrets that revealed the limits of Soviet readiness. When Moscow boasted of submarine strength, American officials knew the truth. Half of those submarines were docked for repairs, their crews exhausted, their patrols predictable. For years, Ivy Bells ran as one of the most successful covert collection programs of the Cold War, but success bred complacency, and complacency invited betrayal. Within the labyrinth of American intelligence, a mole was stirring, one who would sell Ivy Bells for cash, putting an end to one of the boldest wiretaps ever conceived. By the late 1970s, Ivy Bells had become routine. Submarines rotated through the Okhotsk. Divers checked the pods. Tapes flowed steadily back to Langley and Fort Meade. Confidence grew, perhaps too much. The Soviets were suspicious, but still blind. They reinforced patrols, laid new sonar nets, even shifted cables deeper into trenches. None of it stopped the Americans. For nearly a decade, the operation remained untouched. Then came the betrayal. John Anthony Walker, a U.S. Navy chief warrant officer, walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington in 1967 and offered secrets for money. Over the years, Walker provided Moscow with cryptographic keys, war plans, and intelligence that shredded American advantages. By the early 1980s, one of the crown jewels he delivered was the existence of Ivy Bells. For a few $1,000s a month, he told the Soviets what the CIA and Navy had guarded with lives, that an American submarine had tapped their most secure cable. The impact was immediate. Soviet counterintelligence launched an urgent review of undersea communications. Divers were dispatched to inspect the Okhotsk seabed. In 1981, they found it, the pod, disguised as debris, still clamped to the cable. Inside were reels of tape, silent proof that their most private conversations had been stolen for years. The discovery was a humiliation for Moscow. Furious reports landed on desks in the Kremlin. How could their private sea, ringed by radars and patrol boats, have been violated so completely? The cable tap was more than espionage. It was a challenge to Soviet pride, a reminder that even in their safest waters, the Americans could reach them. For the US, the collapse was catastrophic. Analysts at the NSA suddenly lost their clean feed of Soviet naval chatter. Operations were frozen. The risk of continuing was too high. The Soviets were hunting. Worse, Washington now knew that somewhere inside its own system, a traitor was feeding the enemy. But it would take years before Walker's spy ring was fully exposed in 1985. The betrayal forced painful questions in Washington. Had they pushed Ivy Bells too far? Had the hunger for intelligence blinded them to the risks? Inside the CIA, officers defended the program fiercely. The tapes had provided insights that reshaped strategy. The loss, they argued, was not a failure of tradecraft at sea, but of betrayal at home. The submarine crews had done their jobs with brilliance and courage. It was treachery in Washington that had doomed them. For the divers who had risked their lives in the blackness of the Okhotsk, the collapse felt personal. They had trusted their leaders to guard the mission's secrecy, to see it sold for money. The kind of betrayal they knew would have earned them death if they had been Soviet sailors, cut deep. Some spoke of bitterness, others of relief. Perhaps the operation had run as long as it could. Perhaps surviving so many trips into hostile waters was miracle enough. But in Moscow, the discovery fueled paranoia. The Soviets accelerated their counterintelligence drives, interrogating officers, tightening security. They reinforced their belief that the US would stop at nothing to undermine them, even at the bottom of the sea. Ivy Bells had delivered priceless intelligence, but it could not survive betrayal. The deepest wiretap in history had been silenced, not by Soviet sonar, but by an American sailor's greed. When the Soviets hauled the pod out of the Sea of Okhotsk in 1981, they knew they had caught the Americans red-handed. The device was dismantled, studied, displayed in secret photographs for senior party leaders. It became an exhibit of humiliation and fury, proof that their most guarded waters had been infiltrated. Soviet admirals were grilled, counterintelligence chiefs demoted. In internal reports, the phrase repeated again and again was unforgivable negligence. In Washington, the news arrived quietly through channels that could not be named. Ivy Bells was over. The CIA and the Navy locked away the program's files, marking them top secret. The submarine crews were rotated to other missions. Officially, nothing had happened. Unofficially, every man who had swum in those waters carried the memory of blackness, pressure, and silence, and the knowledge that their work had been betrayed from within. The betrayal had a name: John Walker. When Walker and his spy ring were finally exposed in 1985, the scope of the damage staggered American intelligence. Ivy Bells was only one piece. Walker's treachery had handed Moscow years of cryptographic advantage, potentially shifting the nuclear balance. At his trial, prosecutors revealed that his disclosures had blown open cable tap operations and exposed submariners to lethal risk. Walker was sentenced to life in prison. For many in the Navy, it was still not enough. Yet, the legacy of Ivy Bells endured. Analysts who had worked on the tapes acknowledged that the operation had given the US unprecedented clarity on Soviet naval readiness. It had helped confirm weaknesses in the Soviet deterrent, guided US submarine deployments, and even shaped arms control confidence. The operation had been a daring fusion of artistry and engineering. Divers in alien conditions, submarines hovering in hostile seas, pods built to eavesdrop without leaving a scar. Years later, when portions of Ivy Bells were declassified, the details astonished the public. The idea that American submariners had reached under Soviet waters, clamped a pod onto a live cable, and listened for nearly a decade seemed like fiction. It was the kind of story told in spy thrillers, but it had been real. In naval circles, Ivy Bells became a case study in ingenuity and audacity. It showed what was possible when intelligence services and submariners worked as one, when the boundaries of technology and courage were stretched to their limits. It also carried a caution that even the most brilliant operation can be undone by betrayal. Today, Ivy Bells lives in memory as both triumph and tragedy, a triumph of imagination and daring, a tragedy of treachery that silenced it. At the bottom of the Okhotsk, where currents still sweep over the seabed, the ghosts of divers and submariners linger in the silence. They touched the wire that carried the secrets of empires. For a time, they held history in their hands. And when history is written, Ivy Bells remains proof that espionage can reach anywhere, even the bottom of the world.